Hey, my friends, how are you? I'm just pouring some fresh blueberry coffee from my coffee carrier to my mug. It's good to see you. Welcome back. I feel like I was just here. Why is that in the way? Is that out of the way? There we go. I feel like I was just here, and that's because about 14 hours ago I was. Good to see all of you. Hope you're doing well. Did I just wake up? I had a longer night, we can say, and I definitely had a Taco Bell hangover because you all instigated it. You all told me to please. Sorry, I'm having an issue on my end. Can you guys hear me okay? Is everything all right here? Hopefully you can hear me okay. Hopefully we're good here. All right. Sorry, I'm catching up on a few things. Yes, that Taco Bell did not settle great. I will say that, do I feel like I was manipulated into buying Taco Bell last night? Once the super chat started pouring in, I had no choice. I had to buy it. So that's what I did. I definitely bought Taco Bell of my own accord. I delivered it to my house. We hung out last night watching the presidential speech, if you can call it that. And of course, we'll be covering it on the show tomorrow on the Tim and April show. Hey, if you're just joining, welcome. My name is Tim. I am the host of the New Evangelicals podcast. And today, I try and do these lives on Wednesdays. Whenever I can, because I need a space where I can kind of cover whatever I want to cover and not worry about going into some kind of format, right? And so I try and pick up different things. A couple of weeks ago, we covered a really powerful sermon by Dr. Darius Daniels that many of you found super, great and life-giving. And today we're going to cover a conversation by two apologists, Melissa Dougherty and Natasha Crain. It's a pretty interesting conversation. They cover a few different things. I just feel like maybe we should respond to it as we're going through. Of course, our goal is never to dehumanize. We simply want to be able to respond to things that a lot of us, including myself, grew up hearing and kind of see how they shake out now, because it's been very interesting, right? Watching this white evangelical conglomerate thing, just advocate for some very interesting policies in the name of biblical values. So that's what we're going to do. Hey, do me a favor, if you don't mind, if you can give this video a like as you're watching, that would help get it out to more people, and help the YouTube algorithm say, oh, this video looks popular. We'll share it with more folks. I'm interested to see how this goes. I'm reading all your comments here. Absolutely flabbergasted. Yes, I feel that. Should have gotten a breakfast crunch wrap this morning. Yes, good idea. People are asking how my Taco Bell was. It was good, but it didn't sit as well as I hoped. So, okay, let's do this. Let's just kind of start with the people we're talking about. So, hopefully you all can see this okay. Melissa Dougherty, I think it's Dougherty or Dougherty. I'm sorry, Melissa, if you're watching this. I'm not intentionally trying to mispronounce your name. But it says that, according to her website, she's a Christian artist and apologist, best known for her YouTube channel as an ex-New Ager. So she comes from the New Age world. I followed her stuff loosely, full transparency. Melissa and I have talked on DMs, and then she just stopped responding to me. It was a very cordial conversation. It says that she's currently pursuing a master's degree in religious studies. She resides with her husband of 14 years and 2 daughters in New Mexico, where she pursues her online ministry and work as an artist. She has a pretty big channel. I mean, her channel has 338,000 subscribers, so she's certainly no slouch. And most of her videos, I was trying to put my finger on the pulse of what does Melissa, what's her big thing? Seems like she critiques a lot of New Age ideology. She'll go after Oprah and New Agers who are not Christian. She goes after Jehovah's Witness and Mormons, people who she would see as not true Christians. She definitely goes after progressive Christians. And she goes after charismatic Christians. There's a thumbnail down here with a picture of Kenneth Copeland. She went to a Kenneth Copeland conference to kind of investigate it. So I think she does. A lot of that kind of stuff. And so that leads me to think, and again, I don't know. Her statement of faith on her website, I found it. It's pretty typical stuff for a typical evangelical that could go anyway. For example, she says that she believes that the scripture of the Old and New Testament are inspired by God and inerrant in the original text. So that's a pretty typical evangelical view on inerrancy. That could be James White. That could be Kenneth Copeland. They're different people and different systems or different understandings of the Bible, but they would both agree with the inerrancy of the scriptures in the original text. Of course, The caveat to this is that we don't have any of the original text, so how do you know they're inerrant? But that's for a different discussion. She believes in the Trinity, believes in the deity of Jesus, virgin births, in this life, miracles, atoning death. I mean, this is pretty standard Christian stuff. I mean, I would affirm most of these. I would not affirm that the Bible is inerrant for a lot of reasons. But I mean, I believe that the scripture has authority for sure. I believe in the Trinity. I believe in the deity of Jesus. So, I mean, her and I would agree a lot theologically, but it comes out very differently. And so what she did was she had a conversation with Natasha Crain, another apologist type. And she has an article here that we're going to read or kind of go through in a second just to kind of set it up. But, you know, her status or her mantra is equipping Christians to think biblically in a secular culture, worldview, apologetics, culture, parenting. So both of these folks live in like the Sean McDowell world of apologists and apologetics. Frank Turek, who does a lot of work with Turning Point Faith, he's part of this world. Elisa Childers is part of this world. Tim Barnett, they're all kind of part of the same evangelical apologetics world that would hold to like pretty conservative ideals, both theologically and politically. Natasha and Melissa, though, and Elisa, they're a little more covert with like their political leanings. So I don't think like Natasha will come out on her platform and be like, I love Trump. Trump is great. But she will like write articles like this one. So she wrote this article called What the Inauguration and Vibe Shift Means for Christians. I'm just going to read a few paragraphs from this to kind of give you perspective here, and then we're going to get into the video and kind of go through it. She writes, for many Christians, this week's inauguration brought a sense of relief. Harris's radically progressive platform was stopped from further becoming reality for now. By the way, it was Biden who was the president, not Harris, but okay. And Trump immediately started implementing measures to reverse some of the most devastating ideologies and policies of the prior administration: DEI, government censorship, and a nearly open border and gender ideology, to name a few. So right away, we're kind of in culture war land, right? We're talking about culture war things. We're talking about the things that right-wing media has been obsessed with over the past 5 to 6 years now. We're not talking about greed. We're not talking about corporate profits. We're not talking about billionaires. For her, these are the things that bring a sense of relief. She continues, given the extreme polarization we've seen in recent years over these issues and over Trump himself, one might have expected the culture war to be at its height post-election and post-inauguration. But to many people's surprise, including my own, we're instead seeing what is being called a vibe shift. That's a hip way of saying it's getting kind of okay now to not be all in on the most radical progressive ideas and actually publicly admit that you're relieved and even happy about a new direction for the government. Some stuff needed to be fixed, and it's okay to admit as much now. That's her take. Now, she has a new book, When Culture Hates You, Persevering for the Common Good as Christians in a Hostile Public Square. Now, of course, friends, if you've been here for a little bit, if you've been on the channel, obviously I would have a lot of questions if I was talking to Natasha directly. And by the way, Natasha, you're happy to come on the podcast, or you're welcome to come on the podcast. I'd be happy to host you. But this kind of reeks of like just right-wing talking points that we hear from your Charlie Kirks of the world. And that's no surprise because I think Natasha or Melissa works with Frank Turek pretty often, and Frank Turek speaks at Turning Point events. They're kind of obsessed with these major topics, right? Government censorship, of course. What's interesting is that, I mean, just as recently as 2 days ago, Trump announced that we have to start cracking down on student protests and deporting people and expelling them for protesting, which is a clear example of government censorship. But, you know, I digress. And then she says in that one paragraph that, you know, it's getting kind of okay now to not be all in on the most radical progressive ideas and actually publicly admit that you're relieved and even happy about a new direction for the government. Some stuff needed to be fixed, and it's okay to admit as much. And of course, what's interesting about that is there are billionaires who are funding massive organizations like the Daily Wire that does, I think, $380 million in revenue that push against all of this. And they have a huge audience. Like you can absolutely find your tribe, and you can hold these views. Like, I don't understand, you know, why she thinks that because Trump is in office, one of the most vile humans to ever take power, somehow now it's okay to speak your mind. This is well known. Right-wing media sources routinely dominate on social media, for example. So I saw this interview between them going through this, and I thought, you know, why don't we go through it together? They talk about Christian nationalism. I want to get into this. I put the speed at like 1.25, just a little bit faster so we kind of get through it quicker. let's just go through this. Let's hear what they have to say, kind of hear their perspectives here. And let's unpack some of the language that we're hearing. Friends, if you're just joining, welcome in. Please give this video a like. I can see all of your comments. I will put them in underneath whenever I see one that's applicable. And yeah, I'm just glad that you're here. If you have some blueberry coffee, cheers to you. As I nurse my Taco Bell hangover. So hopefully you can hear this. Let me know if you can hear it. Let's get into it. Here we go. Melissa Dougherty on the left and Natasha Crain on the right. Two self-described evangelical apologists, or just apologists. Here we go.
And culture hates you. I know that I will have already probably said this in the intro, but you are one of my favorite authors, and
can y'all hear that all right?
Everything that you write, because not only is it relevant, but it's extremely well written in a way that we can all understand. But you also are not afraid to go after these tough topics that everybody's asking about. So I want to thank you so much for coming on my channel and for writing this book.
Oh, well, thank you so much. It's great to talk to you. I always love talking to you. We have so much fun together.
Well, let's jump right in. Okay, so I have a list of questions here for you, and we're just going to kind of go wherever it goes, because I've read your book and I've endorsed your book, and there really is so many topics that we can hit on, but there's a few topics that I really want to zone in on that I think my viewers would love. But first, let's start with a overall environmental issue that maybe Christians are having, which has to do with the title of your book. You said that there's why culture hates you, right? So there's this culture of hate, so to speak, coming
That's as loud as I can go.
So
sorry.
What does that mean? And why do you think that we are increasingly seeing that in our culture?
Yeah, so I noticed a couple of years ago that increasingly when I was out talking with people and doing conferences and speaking events, things like that, engaging with people online, that people were noticing that there's this increasing hostility in the culture at large, but also in their personal lives. So a lot of people were experiencing the effects of the cultural situation in ways that would lead to family members cutting them off for their beliefs, from friends cutting them off, from some really heated debates that they would get into with people. People were losing jobs. Sometimes people are having trouble getting jobs in the first place. And so I started to notice that people were experiencing this in a lot of ways, and they were saying, but I don't understand how I can address this, because it's not just that culture thinks that we're wrong about these things. It's that culture thinks that we're awful, that we're just terrible people, that we're toxic and harmful and all of these things, to the degree that they're saying, hey, we're just going to cut you off. We're going to get rid of you.
I mean, okay, let's just stop right here. So the premise that Natasha is framing out is that Christians are essentially being persecuted or being treated hostilely for their beliefs. Now, of course, the million-dollar question is what beliefs, right? That's the question. Just like how I'm not sure if we would tolerate anyone, in our family who is openly racist and saying that black people are inferior to white people, or that we can't go to an interracial marriage, etc., for our personal conviction. It depends on what we're talking about here. I do just want to kind of frame this to be clear that like the white evangelical world that Natasha and Melissa operate in is well-funded and very popular. So there certainly is a home for people that would hold beliefs and espouse them loudly and also use those beliefs to infringe on other people's rights. There's a place to do that, and it is in the white evangelical space.
From our lives. And so I noticed that a lot of people were struggling with understanding where that hostility comes from. And at the same time, I started seeing that a lot of people were kind of wanting to shy away from speaking up about their faith in the culture, because obviously no one wants to be hated. No one wants to have these things happen. And so I kind of pulled those themes together for this book so that I could help make sense of the hostility that we're seeing in culture. Why are we seeing this? And kind of just give people what one of my reviewers said, a kick in the pants. That's how she felt after reading this book. Like she said, this book was a kick in the pants and an encouragement at the same time to say, hey, yes, the culture is going to hate us. Jesus actually warned that culture would hate his disciples, his followers. Jesus said this was going to happen, but yet we're still called to be salt and light. We are still called to be the ones who are out there preserving the world and exposing the darkness for what it is.
Okay, so I do think, and I'm not sure, I did watch this once through. I'm not sure if they get into the real details of what it means to be hated by the world and why. What matters is, why does the world hate you? Does the world hate you because you're trying to stop bombs from being dropped on Palestinian children? And the imperial machine of America says, no, we have to do this in the name of imperialism? Or does the world hate you because you don't want to use someone's pronouns? Or because you're actively legislating or actively advocating for legislation that is harming our queer neighbors, or you think that DEI is somehow reverse racist, or is reverse racism, right? Like, what matters is, why does the world, in your mind, hate you? Why are you getting pushed back? That's the key. And for them, ultimately, what it comes down to is the culture war issues, right? It's probably abortion. It's probably queer inclusion. Natasha mentions in her blog DEI, right? So these are things that like are designed to promote human flourishing ultimately. Like the reason, if you want to lower abortion rates, let's advocate for paid family leave and for affordable health care. But Natasha and Melissa probably aren't on board with that. So it's a very interesting thing to be like, we're under attack. The other thing we have to mention here too is that the evangelical world that they're a part of has book industries, publishing industries, music industries, church industries. Like there's a lot of money and people get a lot of notoriety and fame in these spaces. So again, like who exactly hates you? Like who is it? Is it some random secularist in college that doesn't like that you won't use someone's pronouns? Is that what we're talking about? Because you absolutely have a robust evangelical industrial complex that is publishing your material. Melissa herself has 338,000 subscribers on YouTube. I'm not sure if the world really hates you. You seem to be thriving pretty well so far.
So people are experiencing this on a personal level. We're seeing it on a broader level in culture. And I don't know if you want to talk about some of the statistics. We can do that if you want.
Oh, yeah.
But I mean,
Give
some
me
of that
stats.
is into it.
This is one thing I love about your writing is, the statistics are very memorable. I could probably still quote some stats from your other book, Faithfully Different. Give me some stats. Talk about that.
Yeah, just some basic stats, not to get too deep into it. And like you said, I go deep into that in Faithfully Different especially, but just to lay a foundation for why we're starting to see more of the hostility in culture. We know from the research that if you go out and you ask people, hey, how do you identify yourself? Are you a Christian, a Muslim, an atheist, a Jew, etc., that about 65% of Americans will say, hey, I'm a Christian. So self-identified Christians. Yes. But as we know, you can label yourself anything, right? So that is somewhat meaningless to us in terms of evaluating the culture. What's more interesting is that we have other research that tells us what percent of people have what can be considered a biblical worldview.
There it is.
In other words, according to researchers, it represents, if we give you dozens of questions about your beliefs and we look at, do 80% of your answers, at least 80% of your answers line up with what the Bible teaches? What we find from that research is that only about 4% of Americans have a biblical worldview.
Okay, so let's pause. And I know this stat because I used to teach it. She's quoting, I'll put it this way. The first time I read this stat was in the book Unchristian by the Barna Group. What they do is, Barna Group's a big research firm. They say that in their research, most Americans claim to have made a profession of faith at some point in their life. But then they ask those same people if they have a biblical worldview. And really, the biblical worldview is like, it's kind of evangelical, but it's like pretty conservative evangelical framework, like Satan, Satan is a real thing, sin, etc. And they find out that like only 4% of those people have that worldview. And so that's what she's citing here. I used to also kind of parrot this and be like, look, most Christians aren't real Christians. What I learned though, as I deconstructed and found other rooms in the Christian tradition, is that other Christians don't always think that a biblical worldview is key, especially how they define it, to being a Christian. The other thing I will say, to give them credit, is that there definitely is a sense of like a nominal Christianity, right? There are people who just say, yeah, I prayed a prayer one time in youth group and I'm a Christian now. I would also push back strongly on that. I'm a big believer of to be a Christian means to have radical allegiance to the way of Jesus. So I would agree with Melissa and Natasha probably on that point, but we would strongly disagree on what that means regarding how we flesh it out.
So 4% of people see all of reality or most of reality through the lens of what the Bible teaches, and we have this huge gap between that and the 65% who call themselves Christians. And that is rapidly decreasing also. The percent of people with a biblical worldview has decreased significantly over the last 25 years. Yeah,
and again, someone put it here in the comments, but Dan McClellan, many other biblical scholars will tell you that the term of biblical worldview doesn't really exist because it's always in the eye of the beholder. Like which parts of the Bible, in what context, how are we interpreting it, etc.
So in America in particular, that makes sense of why we're starting to see that, wait a second, it's not just as comfortable and as easy as it used to be a Christian. There are more people who at least used to nominally associate with Christianity, and today that's not the case. And so as fewer and fewer people
I was told this when I was like 15.
With Christianity, we're going to see more of this, that there's going to be more open hostility to our beliefs. But like I said earlier, Jesus himself told us this was going to happen, right?
So far, no actual examples of hostility, no definition of hostility. Pushback does not mean hostility. Being told, hey, you're holding bigoted views is not being hostile. It could be a matter of fact. If you think that gay people should not have access to the same rights as heterosexual people do in terms of marriage, right? That's a bigoted view. So again, that just is what it is. But for them, they'll take that as hostility. But you would acknowledge, Natasha and Melissa would say the Bible's clear on this. So I'm not sure why it's even an issue.
He said that if the world hates you, know that it has hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world would love you as its own. But because you are not of the world, but I chose you out of the world, Therefore, the world hates you. So he explained that there's always going to be this hostility between those who are of the world, meaning those who are slave to sin under the governing rule of Satan, and those who are children of God, who are slaves to righteousness, as the Bible puts it.
That's not really like a great definition of the world in the Bible. I've talked to some other scholars about this. It kind of has to do with, again, like the systems, the economics, the power structures at play in their given context, which we can easily map onto America. Who's under the thumb of empire, who's on the underside, etc. To make it so black and white, you're either under the rule of Satan or rule of God, is way too simplistic for very complicated issues, but I digress.
Oh, it shouldn't be any surprise to us that as more people are becoming enslaved to sin, that we're going to see this hostility toward those who are children of God.
These are all loaded terms.
Jesus told it would happen, and we're seeing the effects of it today.
See, these are all loaded terms because you can easily make the case that Donald Trump is enslaved to sin. He's a serial adulterer. He brags about grabbing women. He lies through his teeth. He exploits people. But Natasha celebrates that as a win for Christians. She most likely means the culture war issues, right? Gay people or trans people or queer people getting accepted. Maybe the fact that people are recognizing that systemic racism still exists, right? These are going to come down, I would imagine, to culture war issues because you're not going to see Melissa or Natasha really push back on Trump or the right-wing MAGA world a whole lot. Like we said earlier, Frank Turek, who's another apologist, works with both of these folks and also goes to America Fest routinely. So it's just really important to realize that these words have very different definitions than how you and I might understand them.
Why do you think people hated Jesus?
Well, in that verse that I just quoted, he says that it's about being of the world. So that is the key distinction, I think, that we see repeatedly in Scripture. And that's so important because...
That's wrong. The world hated Jesus, mainly the religious elite, because he didn't fulfill or obey the Mosaic law. And the empire hated him because they thought that he was subverting their rule. That's why the world hated him. Right? Jesus was with the tax collectors and the sinners, and people hated him for being with the underside, not because he was of the world or against the world. Unless you want to assume that the world in his case means his own religious institution, which in that case, people who deconstruct are doing the right thing by pushing back against their own religious institution.
We could, if Jesus just said, the world's going to hate you, didn't give any explanation, we'd kind of be having to come up with our own understanding of that, right? But he specifically gave us the explanation that those who are of the world are the ones who are going to hate the ones who are children of God. So it's really important that we understand that that is the connection. And when culture hates you, I tie all of these passages together that we can pull from the entire New Testament, really, that speak to that people who are enslaved to sin are going to hate it when you shine a light on that darkness. It makes sense, right? No, evil wants to hide on its own. And ultimately, if you're enslaved to sin, if you're under the governing rule of Satan, you want to go your own way. You want to be your own authority, your own boss. You want to do your own thing. It's not about doing Satan's will in particular. It's doing your own will because that's
Sounds
what
like
Satan
Trump.
wants, right?
Sounds
so
like
if
MAGA.
you're a child of God who looks to God as your authority and you're doing what God wants, those things are going to be in conflict. And so no one wants to have the light shined on their darkness.
This whole thing is based on authority, power.
Ultimately, yes,
it's right there.
Culture is going to hate Christians, but ultimately they hate God. Ultimately, they hate God because he is the authority and they're not. We're just
so the way this works for folks like Melissa and Natasha is that we have a biblical worldview. The Bible's inerrant. We are reading the Bible correctly. We know that God has an absolute standard. We understand that standard. So people who don't agree with us are actually disagreeing with God, right? They actually, it's actually quite a prideful take to have. We are the ones who have the corner on how the God of Almighty, how the God of the universe, who spoke everything into existence, we have the corner on what that God thinks about human sexuality, about racism, about all the culture war issues. And those who do not submit to how we understand the Bible are therefore being handed over to Satan. That's what they're saying. That's absolutely what they're saying here. Completely. And then whatever their margin of error is, so they have a certain Overton window of who's allowed to disagree with them on certain issues, but on other issues they're not. And this goes back to in Elisa Childers and Tim Barnett's book, The Deconstruction of Christianity. They talk about things like, the Bible's clear on abortion. It is? The Bible really never mentions abortion, and abortion is actually a very complicated topic. So they actually they tend to flatten out things and make it seem like, oh, this is clear as the sky is blue. And if you don't adhere to this, you no longer have a biblical worldview. If you don't have a biblical worldview, you're not following God. So if you don't agree with us, you're not following God, and you're handed over to Satan, unless you're MAGA. Because they're so loose. I mean, Trump the other day had a statue of himself in a video in the middle of Gaza as King Trump. You're not going to hear these people push back on that. It's uncanny, in my opinion.
as messengers.
That's so good. Yes. Okay. So I have an offshoot question from here. Because when I was reading your book, there was one thing that I kept thinking about, and I was trying to think of a way to put it in a categorical kind of question. Can you define the difference between what did I write down? The martyr, I'm going to call it like a martyr complex hate, right? Where you have Christians that, oh, everybody's going to hate me. I'm just speaking truth. I'm doing this, I'm doing that. But they almost don't feel like they're doing God's will unless they're being hated, versus like a biblical hate that Jesus talks about. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I haven't been asked that before. I do think that you see some people in culture that are seeking, or they cry persecution on everything, right? There are a few of those
His name is
cases.
Sean Foyt.
Excuse me, where you see Christians who are saying, oh, this Facebook post did not get shown, therefore, the culture hates me. Therefore there is persecution. Now, you and I both know that there have definitely been many examples where that certain posts on social media are getting pushed down the algorithms because of the content. So I'm not suggesting that's not the case.
Okay, wait. You're using an example of what you think is someone crying wolf. But then you validate that example by saying, well, we know that there are certain examples of the algorithm pushing down someone's content. I don't know if Melissa and Natasha know that this is a thing for all content creators. I am a content creator. I make content every day. I will tell you, I've done posts critiquing Trump that have gotten suppressed. I've done videos on all kinds of things. That does not mean that Natasha or Melissa or their world is somehow being targeted by big tech. In fact, statistically speaking, right-wing media and ecosystems and talking points do the best on social media. So it's so weird to hear her be like, yeah, that's kind of extreme, but we know it still happens. Does it? Just because you're a Christian? Or is it the content of what you're advocating for? When you say, hey, maybe gay people shouldn't have the same rights that we have, maybe people are going to push back on that because it's an asinine comment to make in a secular society. Just saying.
But I'm just saying that sometimes we can overreact to things and think that, the world is coming out for us, and those kinds of things. And I think we have to be careful in saying that. But I think that because Jesus tells us specifically why we're hated, we know that this is going to come. You don't have to seek it. It's going to come when you're doing what we are called to do. So we need to be the ones who are speaking up and sharing truth, knowing that there's also a really good possibility that some people are going to hate us for it. So it's not that you seek the hate and seek the suffering. It's that you seek out of obedience to live the way that God wants us to, and knowing that that can be an outcome of it. So I think there's a difference between knowing that's going to be a likely outcome of what you do and seeking the outcome itself. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does. Yeah. And I think that you do a good job of kind of explaining, like even the stats that you just gave, there's a minority there with the Christian biblical worldview. And if you believe what the Bible teaches, that's in the minority. In that regard. So I think that kind of speaks for itself too. Now,
I think if I could just...
Okay, hold on. I got to respond to this. I'm not sure about you all. You are looking at someone who grew up in the world that Melissa and Natasha are a part of. I grew up very conservative Christian. I grew up with this mentality. The world's going to hate you. The world's not going to like you. The way it was always taught to me, it was always around very specific issues. It was always around making sure that abortion is outlawed everywhere and that we overturn Roe v. Wade. And if people push back on you for that, that's an example of the world hating you for your Christian beliefs. The reason why the world will hate me for my Christian beliefs is because I don't think that gay people should be allowed to get married in the country. And so what they did was they attached very specific culture war issues that, by the way, have been debated and also, long story short, make no sense to really advocate for long term, especially the gay marriage part, right? But there was never, and I'm telling you, if you're new to the channel, look, I have all the street cred, okay? Like, I planted the churches, I did the worship stuff, I did the parachurch ministries, I worked for Child Evangelism Fellowship, one of the biggest organizations in the world, reaching boys and girls with the gospel of Christ. There was never any connection of a biblical worldview or being hated for your faith when it came to advocating for the abolishment of the death penalty, when it came to how we think about corporate greed at the expense of the working class, when it came to being more merciful and not more hateful, when it came to being more inclusive and not less inclusive. This whole framework operates around a certain set of presuppositions that are invisible to most people unless you're deeply involved in this world. So, and again, I don't know Melissa or Natasha personally. Based on what I've seen by them, I would imagine that what they're talking about is every time you say that abortion must be banned, every time that you say People are being transed. It's an ideology. Every time you don't use someone's preferred pronouns, every time you say that maybe we shouldn't have gay people being married in the country, that's when the world's going to hate you. But those ultimately and they'll say that's a biblical worldview. But in my opinion, when you start actually reading the Bible and realizing how complicated it is, the Bible's quite quiet on some of those things, or it's contradictory. One example I'll give, then we'll move on to the next segment here, is sexuality, right? You're taught that the Bible's clear. Marriage is between one man and one woman for life. But the Bible isn't clear on that. Sorry. Even from the beginning, if you take Genesis 2 literally, which many of these people tend to, they tend to take the Genesis 1 and 2, the creation accounts, not as metaphor, not as allegory, but as a literal event that happened. Well, if Adam and Eve were the first two people ever to exist on this planet, and we all came from them, you do realize that logically, people had to start sleeping with other people that they were related to, right? You do realize that, like, at some point, kids had to start sleeping with kids. Like, it gets real wacky real quick. So if the setup since the beginning of time was one man, one woman for life, God set things up kind of wacky if Genesis 2 really happened literally. Just saying. And by the way, Genesis 1 both Genesis 1 and 2 have no marriage ceremony. Genesis 1 says, be fruitful and multiply. That's all it says. It tells humankind, plural, to be fruitful and multiply. No mention of monogamy, no mention of covenant. That's all presupposed into the text. So I'm just saying, this whole presupposition I find to be a house of cards once you start examining it. Friends, welcome in to the podcast. We are to the show. We're responding to Melissa Dougherty and Natasha Crain, two evangelical apologists, on what it means to be hated for your faith. And we're going to get into Christian nationalism soon. If you're just joining, do me a favor, give this video a like. It really helps to get out there into the algorithm. I try and go live once a week on this channel on Wednesdays. And we also go live on the Tim and April show Monday and Thursdays, helping you understand what's going on in politics and culture from a Christian worldview. Glad you're here. Let's keep going. Friends, I know that I have the speed at 1.25 for the video. Hopefully that's not too fast for you. This is the longer interview, so I didn't want it to go too long. Let me know what you think. If you want me to slow it down, I can. But for me, it's pretty listenable.
One thing to that too, I think that a lot of non-believers, I think that they hear the title of the book, like When Culture Hates You, and they think that we're all just a bunch of whiny crybabies. So I know that, in fact, there's already one review on Goodreads that gave my book a 1 star, and clearly she didn't read it. But it was like, it's propaganda. The culture doesn't hate you. They hate Christians. Christians are the ones who are bigots, and this is exactly proving the point. Right? Yeah. This is exactly what I'm saying. And and I've seen a few skeptics, when people share about,
Wait. Pushback to your claim that maybe isn't true is not hostility, it's pushback. That's how the world operates. Someone giving you data, which I can give and we've all given. I mean, even in Congress, like 90% of Congress identifies as Christian. Now, what Melissa and Natasha would say is, yeah, but do they have a biblical worldview? And that's the trick. The trick is, yeah, but do they believe like how we believe about Christianity? If they don't, then they're not real Christians, right? Melissa and Natasha either fail to acknowledge how big the Christian tradition is, all the different rooms inside of it, or they realize it and believe that those rooms that they deem not biblical enough are not part of the true faith.
My book on X, and especially that non-believers will come along and they really hate the title of the book, which is interesting to me because they really hate this idea that Christians are the hated ones because they think we're the haters, right? And that's the whole purpose of the book is to explain why the culture hates us on those topics, and yet they're the ones coming along and saying, hey, no one hates you, stop with the persecution complex and that kind of thing. So
if you want a good book on this that's really accessible, that you can give your pastors, look up the book Heavy Burdens by Bridget Eileen Rivera. She documents in the 80s and 90s how Christians, conservative evangelical Christians, were the most brutal people towards the gay community during the AIDS crisis. Okay, again, I find it so interesting. 1 Corinthians 5, Paul tells us not to judge the world, but to hold our own to account inside the church. And Melissa and Natasha just gloss over like the decades of legislation that's been pushed by Christians to minimize the rights of other people groups, whether right now it's trans people, as we see happening in Iowa, or it's trying to overturn Obergefell, which many people are advocating for. So all I'm asking for Melissa and Natasha to do is just to actually read some real history by real scholars to see that, like, actually, hate to tell you this, but in many cases, I'll let myself in because I was born in this world and was a part of it, we're on the wrong side of history, whether it's integration in the civil rights era, whether it's race-based chattel slavery, whether it's queer inclusion, we've been on the wrong side. Sorry, we just have. That's not being hostile. That's giving you some data points.
Well, they go along telling you why they hate you.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, so it'll be fun to see how many interesting reviews that I get just on the title of the book. They're like reviewing the title, not the book itself.
Yes.
Well, it's a controversial title.
You know what's very interesting about that, Natasha, is that think of any other religion or any other people group writing a book with that title. You wouldn't find a Muslim saying, "Oh, when culture hates you." You know what I mean? Like you wouldn't find there's certain beliefs that are popular within culture even.
I'm sorry. Were they around during 9/11 when like the entire American population thought that all Muslims were trying to blow themselves up and kill people? Like Melissa, you got to be close to my age. I remember Sean Hannity every day going after imams and radical jihadists and Sharia law. Like, yeah, I mean, right now in my state, a Muslim family was arrested by ICE, the mother and the father, because their immigration status is in jeopardy. You could easily write a book from a Muslim perspective of when culture hates you. Like, wow, that is a shockingly empty take, and it just, frankly, a totally ignorant one, 100%. Wow.
In that regard, and if in other words, and this segues me into my next question, there's something you write about with the common good. And going forth with what is true, whether it's popular or not, how do you define that? Talk about the common good. Yes. What does that mean?
Yeah, so When Culture Hates You is the title, but the subtitle is very long and hard to remember, unlike the title. It's persevering for the common good as Christians in a hostile public square. So very long, but very important, because this is really the thrust of the book is when the culture hates you, when that's the case, and you have this hostility, let's understand that in light of it, how do we persevere for the common good? And so how do you define the common good? A lot of people have some baggage with this term. Some people have never heard it, and then other people have a little bit of baggage with it because it's a term that's been used by many people in many different ways. In fact, when I first posted that I had this book coming out on Facebook, one of the first comments I ever got, it's like, yay, here's my new book. I'm all excited. And one of the very first comments that I got was, oh, there's a red flag here because the common good, that's what people use to justify socialism or something along.
Hear the world that she's a part of. The common good isn't socialist. We're a society. A society is comprised of many types of people. We look for a common good. That's not socialism. That's just being a good human. This just shows how deeply embedded the hyper-individualistic Western idea is of the individual. Not that that's a bad thing. Okay, individualism can be a good thing, but we're so hyper in that way that even thinking about the common good for some people triggers socialism.
Those lines. So I recognize that people will use that differently. As I say in the book, I'm not importing any of those meanings into this. What we're talking about with
a lot of you are asking the video sped up. It is. Do you want me to slow it back down? It's a long interview. I mean, I'll sit with you guys through the whole thing. I just figured I'd speed it up. Give me a thumbs up if you want me to turn that off and go back to normal.
Flourishing that normal people want for their life in common at any level of society. So it could be, at a county level, a city level. Most of what I'm talking about the book is for our country. So at an entire country level. So what is the common good? What is good for the flourishing of the life that we have in common? That's really what I'm talking about. But as I point out in the book, most of the culture wars that we have are over this common good. It's not, though, that one group of people are like, I want what I believe is good for society, and another group is saying, I actually want what's bad for society. We call those people antisocial. We call them psychopaths sometimes.
Yeah,
right? We have all kinds of
names
for that kind of mentality, like I want to destroy society, right? Normally speaking, normally functioning people want what they believe is good for society.
True.
The question is, what is actually good for society?
Yes.
What is truly good for society?
Empirical
and a lot
data,
of times,
science.
Christians have fallen into the trap of thinking,
Affordable
we
wages.
all have different opinions about that, so I guess we're just going to enter the ring and we're all going to battle it out. But Christians have to be really clear
pluralism.
that if Christianity is true, then what the Bible teaches corresponds to reality, and there's one good. There's one definition of good.
Okay,
because
there it is. Okay, so this is such this is a classic apologist move, right? Is they ask a really good question. That's complicated. The common good. How do you think about that? And look, we can rattle off a few things right now. We think the common good is people are not in medical debt for getting access to healthcare. That sounds reasonable. We could defend that. Maybe we talk about how in America, the world's richest country, maybe having access to livable wages if you work a full-time job should be mandated for the common good, right? It promotes human flourishing, maybe paid family leave, things like that, right? Melissa, and Natasha are going to then point back to the Bible. They're going to flatten the Bible out and make it seem like the Bible has one consistent through line of morality that always revolves around these culture war topics. And therefore, for Christians, meaning people like them, they have to make sure that their neighbors assimilate into this idea of what is the true common good because the Bible corresponds to reality. Now, there's a lot there we could unpack. I will just say that a collection of ancient documents written over the span of 1,000 years in different cultural contexts, moments, and points in history, assembled by dozens of people and edited and revised and added and subtracted, and then interpreted from Greek and Hebrew into Latin and all other kinds of languages, probably isn't going to be the clearest thing that we can reference to find the common good in 2025 America. Not saying that we can't find wisdom and the teachings of Jesus that are really helpful for how we navigate today, but to make it seem like the Bible is a monolithic book that just has one consistent through line of morality around these issues, I think is incredibly disingenuous. I'm just saying.
God himself is the only standard for what is good. So if culture is not using God as their standard for the time, so I guess we're just going to enter the ring and we're all going to battle it out. But Christians have to be really clear that if Christianity is true, then what the Bible teaches corresponds to reality, and there's one good. There's one definition of good because God himself is the only standard for what is good.
See how they conflate the Bible with God, right? The Bible is inerrant. God wrote it. Therefore, whatever's in the Bible, God said. And therefore, God is talking. So Bible, God, they're interchangeable terms. I think that's kind of dangerous.
Or is not using God as their standard for determining what's good, which of
the
course
Bible.
Culture doesn't. They're going to get their notion of the common good wrong in many cases.
That's
not in every
true.
case, because sometimes these things will happen to line up. But
but
you are going
the
to
Bible-
know that you're never going to consistently be in line with God's standards when you're choosing other standards, such as how people feel, the amount of freedom they want to have, all these kinds of things.
Oh my
and
goodness.
so
I mean, again, how do you define God's standard in the Bible? Is it in the parts where he talks about destroying the Canaanites? Is it the parts where he regulates slavery? Is it the Deuteronomy? Is it the Hebrew Bible and the laws in there? Is it the New Testament? Like, which part are we talking about here? Because there's a lot that we can pull from that will present very contradictory statements. Melissa and Natasha would just say, you have to have the right hermeneutic to understand the Bible. So again, it comes back down to their interpretation, how they interpret these texts, and then they kind of pull a bait and switch, and instead of being, I would argue, intellectually honest that, hey, just like all of us, we're trying our best to interpret a very complicated collection of ancient texts, they would say, no, the Bible is clear and we have that clarity. I just don't think it's reasonable.
for the Christian, we have to be really clear that the common good has to be rooted in God himself. That is how we have to define good, not by any of culture standards.
You know what it reminds me of is Thanos in the Avengers. You know, what he's trying to do is for the common good, right?
Okay.
And have you seen it? Have you seen
I
that movie?
haven't. I'm not a movie person. I'm sorry, I cannot
But
join
Natasha,
on this
it's
to
the
say, yes,
Avengers.
just like
Come on.
Thanos.
We've all seen it. We've all seen it,
You will
Natasha.
get so many memes and so many inside jokes if you watch
Come on, Natasha,
Avengers
hook me
Endgame.
up.
Okay.
Yeah, basically, in short, he's trying to get the Infinity Stones because he's trying to wipe out half of the population in order for it to thrive in the long run. And everybody's trying to stop him. And he's like, it's basically for the common good. I'm doing this for you kind of thing. And
Super demented,
the
but
ethics
yes.
behind that are so interesting.
I agree.
In fact, my seminary professor, it was
It's
in an
an
ethics
interesting
class,
thought
a Christian
experiment.
ethics class, that he brought up this example. And he's like, yeah, this is what this is. Like, is it for the common good? And so it was really interesting for you to break that down, because I know that there's some people that might be confused with that definition.
Yeah, and that's a whole other, example of, do we give up the individual good for the common good? Because you can have
Exactly.
all kinds of bad outcomes from that. And I think sometimes that's what people have in mind by it. And you can justify anything in the name of the common good, right?
Exactly.
You can
Yes.
justify anything by saying, well, we're going to kill off a few people, but it's for the common good. So
Yeah. You can also justify this by saying that, certain people shouldn't have the same rights as other people for the common good, or because the Bible's clear. So it goes either way.
we have to be really clear on what good actually is, because we also have to be considering the individual good. So saying that something's for the common good doesn't need to imply that it's not also for the individual good.
Sure.
In fact, in the book, what I really emphasize is understanding what it means to be for the individual good. What it means that if we are people, human beings who are made in the image of God,
Yes.
and we are actually created with given purpose,
Yes.
and given the reality of our sin nature, and putting all these theological pieces together about anthropology, who is mankind. I
Yes.
talk about that in the book. When we put those pieces together, then we're in a position to determine what is actually good for people on both an individual level as well as a societal level for everyone. So the common good is not
For
meant
everyone.
to imply
A societal level for everyone. So is Natasha and Melissa open to other people of faith and different perspectives, reasoning with them to find the common good? Or do they believe that Christians like them should be privileged in society and should be given extra access and power to make laws for the common good because they have the objective truth of God, while their Muslim neighbor, atheist neighbor, agnostic neighbor, Hindu neighbor does not, and therefore can never actually arrive at any kind of legitimate moral common good because their foundation is flawed? That's how they see this. For Melissa and Natasha, you cannot underestimate this. They have an understanding and clarity of what God wants for all of humanity. And anyone outside of the world that they are a part of that doesn't hold a biblical worldview does not. And you can see how this can get translated into, well, why would we give our Muslim neighbor access to power when it comes to shaping laws? They're already flawed with how they view the world. They don't have a biblical worldview. You can see how it's not a big step to get to Christian nationalism, which they're going to get into. And we're really going to go to town on that. We're really going to go to town on Christian nationalism when they get into it. But you can see how it's not a big leap to make.
In my usage of it, that we should do something to cover up what could be bad for individuals. It's, hey, how do we talk about what's good for individuals and therefore what's good for groups of individuals?
Exactly. Yes. And there's so much more in the book, you guys. You're going to have to get the book to kind of uncover, because this is just one area of that Natasha writes about. So make sure that you get the book to know more about this. But I'm going to segue into some meat into your book. Okay. So
let's do it.
Every time you write a book, this is what I love about the way that you write, is that you cover these things head on with such poise. And there's two topics that you talk about. The first one I'm going to ask you about is Christian nationalism.
I'm
are
so
one of
excited
the
for
only.
this.
Well, that's not true. I would say that there's other Christian authors out there that have covered it. But the way that you cover it specifically in your book, like you devote a pretty good, like a whole chapter to Christian nationalism and beyond, I would say.
Okay, hold on. Listen to what she says, and then see if you catch it. See if you catch what I caught. Listen to it. Let's back up a minute.
Book. This is what I love about the way that you write, is that you cover these things head on with such poise. And there's two topics that you talk about. The first one I'm going to ask you about is Christian nationalism. You are one of the only, well, that's not true. I would say that there's other Christian authors out there that have covered it. But the way that you cover it specifically in your book, like you devote a pretty good, like a whole chapter to Christian nationalism and beyond, I would say, to what this is. And it's a topic that I think a lot of Christians are like, oh, I don't want to.
Okay. Did you hear the setup? Maybe a few other Christian authors have covered this topic, and you really devote a lot of time to it, aka in one chapter in your book. The way I laughed out loud at that statement. Now, listen, I'm not an expert on everything. I don't know everything. That's impossible. But when I know something and someone gets it wrong, it's glaringly obvious. And this just demonstrates who Melissa thinks are real Christians, because there's a whole world of academic scholarship written by Christians. One example is this book, American Idolatry: How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, by Andrew Whitehead, a good friend and a devoted Christian. There's Kristen Dumais, who tracks this stuff. There's Matthew Taylor, another scholar, also a Christian, who has written extensively on Christian nationalism. I gotta say, with all due respect to Melissa, it is a little comical to hear you tell Natasha that she's done the deep dive on Christian nationalism when there's a whole world of academic scholarship and books written about what Christian nationalism is, what it isn't. Diana Butler Bass, Robbie Jones over at PRRI. And then you have some non-Christians too who used to be Christian. Bradley Onishi, Anthea Butler. This is off the top of my head. There are so many books written from an academic, empirical perspective on what we think Christian nationalism is, how we define it, and what goes into it. Tim Alberta, thank you. Yeah, Melissa, good point. Tim Alberta, there's many more. And to hear her say what she said, it's like, I'm sorry, I would not trust Natasha Crain at all on this topic, but she wrote a whole chapter on it, so I guess she's now a credible source. So let's see what she has to say about Christian nationalism, because wowsies. All right, here we go.
I don't want to touch that. I don't want to go there. We have such confusion over what this is. So first, can you let's just define for me what Christian nationalism is, and if it's good, bad, somewhere in between. Give us somewhere where we can have some traction with this.
So I can't give you a perfect definition because no one's using the word in the same way. So that's the irony of this whole thing. There's no
postmodern word.
Yeah,
a postmodern word. Words change meaning all the time. The word gay back in the 1920s means something incredibly different than what it means today. That's not postmodern. Words change meaning as culture changes. We used to, the word literal now is like more hyperbolic, right? He literally did this to me, but he really didn't. This is how words work. And yes, there is a pool of scholarship, Natasha and Melissa, that has been defining and working on this for a long time. There's some nuance to it for sure, but there are some consistent through lines. So not sure what books she read, but kind of embarrassing, to be honest.
You can't even really, like, you know, in other cases, you could look back at a whole history of a word, for example, and say, well, this is what it's always meant. And, you know, today there are some differences on that, but this is the standard. With Christian nationalism, you really can't, because if you ask 100 people what it is, you're going to get 100 different answers. And so that's the starting place for the conversation, is just if somebody is ever wanting to engage on that question, you have to ask them, well, what do you mean by that? Because it could be a good thing or it could be a bad thing, depending on what someone's definition is. So for purposes of my book, the first part of the book, 5 chapters, kind of sets up all these foundational concepts about the common good, like we were talking about, and why the hate, and when the common good is political, answering some objections, things like that. The second half of the book, then I take 5 of the most pressing and urgent issues in our culture today that I feel Christians really need more understanding of with respect to advocating for the common good. And these are also, at the same time, subjects where we get a lot of hostility. So that's how Christian nationalism ends up in the book. That chapter is called Dangerous Christian Nationalists, because that's how the media sees us. So it's the view from mainstream media.
See, these are all coded. Mainstream media. These are all coded things. Like, Natasha, it's obvious. It's obvious that you are conservative, evangelical Christian, but politically and theologically. Stop pretending that like you're not. It's very clear. By the way, just to be, for sake of this live, okay, I'm going to draw from an academic who has like written about this extensively. Here's a working definition that we can think of the Christian nationalism. There's some nuance to it. We can look at PRRI and their data, how they track this. We can get, by the way, if you want to do it, we'll get into all of this during the live. So this is page 29 of Andrew's book, American Idolatry. Christian nationalism combines a number of elements. The first element is a strong moral traditionalism based on creating and sustaining social hierarchies. Oftentimes, these revolve around gender and sexuality. Sound familiar? The second element is a comfort with authoritarian social control. The world is a chaotic place, and at times society needs strong rules and rulers to make use of violence, or at least the threat of violence, to maintain order. The final element is a desire for strict boundaries around national identity, civic participation, and social belonging that fall along ethno-racial lines. A Christian nation is generally understood to be one where white, natural-born citizens are held up as the ideal, with everyone else coming after. There's one definition, okay? So right away, one definition, and there are receipts for this, right? So there you go. I mean, it took me about 5 minutes to read one layman's book by an academic to find a description. Here we are.
So I'm specifically addressing how mainstream media uses the term Christian nationalism against Christians. That's my purpose with that chapter, because honestly, most of the conversation, the vast majority of the conversation really that's going on around this term comes from the mainstream media.
Yes.
So
Not true. Not true. No, most of this blew up on Twitter a few years ago after the January 6th insurrection. You know, when Christians stormed our Capitol building with Jesus flags and Make America Great hats and Bibles. And then so the initial, in my opinion, let's back up. Let me give you guys a small history lesson here, because this is way more my world at this point. If you want to back up and look at what was the first real source for the Christian nationalism explosion, it's the book by Samuel L. Perry and Andrew Whitehead called Taking America Back for God. Sorry, the next one was Flag on the Cross. That was the first book that had some empirical research behind this term Christian nationalism, how we think about it. And then January 6th happened. Remember that, friends? Remember when we saw the Christian flag, the same flag that you and I pledged allegiance to in our little Awana Bible clubs? That was flying through the Capitol building when Christians stormed it. And remember, there was a prayer to Jesus thanking him for this moment to take over? Okay, that's what we're talking about. So it wasn't from the mainstream media. Natasha has such a bias towards this belief that the mainstream media hates Christians that she's willing to kind of ignore a lot of that data, and I haven't researched it apparently, and just say, well, the media started it. As if it wasn't concerned Christians. Samuel Perry's a Christian. Andrew Whitehead's a Christian. Kristen Dumais is a Christian. Matthew Taylor is a Christian. Anthea Butler, I'm not sure if she is, but I think at one point she was a Christian. Bradley Onishi was a Christian. I'm a Christian. Over at the Baptist Joint Committee, they're all Christians, raising the alarm about Christian nationalism. So this is Christians also doing this. Gosh, it's so frustrating.
By it. See, I had to give you this whole backdrop for it because it's such a confusing topic.
It's not that confusing.
When you dig into it, there are hundreds of thousands of hits if you were to Google Christian nationalism. And so there's no way that you can aggregate that in some kind of automated way where it's like, okay, in 58% of the cases, they're talking about this. You can't do that. So what I did is just manually surveyed hundreds of pieces of content online from various media outlets, all kinds of mainstream media, to see if they are talking about quote unquote Christian nationalism in their headlines, what examples are they giving in the content itself to help me understand, okay, this is what they think Christian nationalism is. Okay. So this is, I'm kind of backing into it because, again, everyone's using it in such different ways. When you do that, what you find is that in the vast majority of cases, what they're calling Christian nationalism is really Christians who are advocating for their views as public policy rooted in a biblical understanding of the world.
No.
So, translation, if you're advocating for conservative, unpopular positions,
No.
positions that progressives hate,
This
you
isn't
are
true.
now a Christian nationalist.
No, this is
That is the
nonsense. This is nonsense. This is nonsense. Russell Moore is a conservative Christian. He would probably be in favor of a more pro-life position. I don't believe that he thinks that queer people should be allowed to get married like inside the church, etc. He's also not a Christian nationalist. As we just described, Christian nationalism is very much focused on social hierarchies, who's in charge, and who gets the power. Okay? So that's what we're talking about here. Now, just for kicks and giggles, let's just do a little thought. Let's do a little experiment here. Let's just Google Christian nationalism. Now let's just do what is Christian nationalism. And let's go, I don't know, wherever. Let's see. PBS. Okay. What is Christian nationalism? This is the first hit. All right. So the first hit, now remember, she said that it was, actually, you know what? I don't want to misrepresent her. Let's just go back and hear what she has to say.
Are they giving in the content itself to help me understand, okay, this is what they think Christian nationalism is.
Okay.
So this is, I'm kind of backing into it because, again, everyone's using it in such different ways. When you do that, what you find is that in the vast majority of cases, what they're calling Christian nationalism is really Christians who are advocating for their views as public policy rooted in a biblical understanding of the world.
Okay. So, oh wait, she gives the translation.
So, translation, if you're advocating for conservative, unpopular positions, positions that progressives hate, you are now a Christian nationalist.
Okay, that's not true. First hit from PBS. White Christian nationalism has been in the headlines quite a lot as of late. Brad Onishi is a former evangelical minister who once identified as a Christian nationalist himself. He left the church in 2005 and began studying religion and extremism. Okay, Bradley Onishi is one of the leading scholars on this topic. One of the leading scholars. And that's the first hit on my Google when you type in, well, second hit besides Wikipedia. What is Christian nationalism? An academic source of what we're talking about in a special by PBS. I just don't know like what Melissa is talking about here. I truly do not. If by conservative you mean we have to take over and rule from the top down and enforce our morals regarding sexual orientation and abortion and these other cultural war issues, maybe. But we can go one step further. Let's just do this. This is alive. We have time. PRI is one of the most well-respected research firms on Christian nationalism. They do this stuff for a living. Okay. And again, they break this stuff down. They have executive summaries. These are detailed things, friends. And again, you can read this whenever you want. This is totally free. It's totally available. This is not some academic thing. Okay. Okay. So let's just do how they measure Christian nationalism. Again, people who do this stuff, who take it seriously, they have a framework they're operating in. They're not just willy-nilly throwing these terms around like a beach ball at a Nickelback concert. So here's what this says. To measure Christian nationalism, PRI used a battery of 5 questions about the relationship between Christianity, American identity, and the U.S. government. The questions were first developed for the PRI Brookings Christian Nationalism Survey, which was based on data collected in late 2022 and released in a major report in February 2023. All right, so I'm going to skip down a little bit. This was a sample of 5,000 Americans. Respondents in our American Values Atlas were asked whether they completely agree, mostly disagree, or completely disagree with each of the following statements. 1. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. Now, to be clear, you can be a conservative Christian, and not believe that. Very easy. 2. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. 3. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. 4. Being a Christian is an important part of being truly American. 5. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society. Okay? And then what they did was they gave people a score and they broke it down. They broke it down into adherents, sympathizers, skeptics, rejectors, and then people who skipped. And here's what they found. They have a whole map here of state by state how much of the population by percentage believes this stuff. And they break it way down. Guys, we could do a whole other live breaking down the relationship between Christian nationalism and Donald Trump. It's all right there. Like it's all right there. All right there. And for some reason, Natasha skips over all of that and goes, it's a slur by the media. That mainstream media. If you're a conservative Christian, you're automatically a Christian nationalist. What are you talking about, Natasha? With all due respect, you're an apologist, right? Data matters, research matters. You want the truth. There's so much data on this. It's available freely. How you missed this and didn't treat this topic seriously is beyond me. Are y'all hanging in there? You all good? Are you okay? I know I'm going here. This is more of what I do in my wheelhouse, so I feel a little more qualified to talk about it. I'm glad you're here. Give this video a like. It means so much. Let's keep going.
That is the case the vast majority of the time. So for example, if you look up an article that talks about dangerous Christian nationalism that is theocratic and anti-democratic, yes. And you start to read what they're talking about, they'll be talking about how Christians are advocating for pro-life causes. They'll be talking about how Christians are anti-trans and trying to push through bills to prevent kids from using puberty blockers, for example.
Well,
so when you start looking at the examples they're giving, you're thinking, wait a second, how is this any different than anyone else advocating for their views?
Yeah, well, it's not what it is, right? Obviously, we can all advocate for our views. But we want to find views and we want to have laws that promote the human flourishing of all of our neighbors. Natasha and Melissa based all of this on a really strict fundamentalist Christian ideology that's based on a very specific interpretation of the English Protestant Bible that they then say, because of our religious convictions, you now have to assimilate into this. You can get to other values without going the religious route. Me and my atheist neighbor can find the common ground on why affordable health care would benefit the common good and the individual. I can do it from a Christian perspective. He can do it from an atheist perspective. Saying, though, that the Bible's clear, God made them male and female, and therefore we should restrict access, healthcare access to people who might be trans or going through gender dysphoria is an exclusively fundamentalist Christian perspective that other people should not be forced to assimilate into. That's the difference. That's the difference. I'm not saying that can't get complicated. There is a nuance there. I'm not saying any of that. But there is a way to kind of parse this out.
Right? They just label this Christian nationalism because it's coming from Christians. And we want to, quote unquote, impose our values nationally.
I mean, to be clear, sorry, I'm pausing a lot here. But to be clear, back to that page, right, from Andrew's book here. Part of the definition he gave of white Christian nationalism, it's oftentimes, the first element is a strong moral traditionalism based on creating and sustaining social hierarchies. Oftentimes, these revolve around gender and sexuality. And here's Natasha saying, what? We don't want kids to have access to healthcare with their parents and their doctors? We want the state to be involved? Oh, we're Christian nationalists. Well, I mean, on that side, it's a telltale sign. It's a telltale sign according to the research that Andrew Whitehead has found.
Language that they're using. Now, I can keep going if you want, or you can jump in here with a question.
A follow-up question. Yeah. You're right. Because every time I've ever heard this, with some exceptions, which I'll get into in a second, anytime I've ever heard the term used, it's in a derogatory way.
Yes.
And what I have heard people pose it as is that Christians are like trying to take over America. Like
they are.
You said theocracy. And I think, okay, like a dominion kind of thing. Like you're trying to take over America. You're trying to impose like Old Testament law in America.
True. His name's Doug Wilson.
What do you think about that? Throw some corrections at me. Like, what do you think of as far as if that definition is correct, and are there Christians actually trying to impose that?
Yes, there are.
So this is a really good point. So there are theological discussions that take place, especially on X, in different corners of the internet, that are more in terms of like the theological aspects of, should we be advocating for some kind of official Christianity at some level in our country? I'm not addressing that in the book.
Then why are you talking about Christian nationalism? That's a key part of this. And also, don't minimize it by going to X or Twitter. Doug Wilson has a robust publishing arm. He's been interviewed by Tucker Carlson. He wants Jesus Christ as Lord in the Constitution. And again, Natasha, this is your world. Like Doug Wilson swims in the waters that you and your friends swim in. How are you that blind to what's coming downstream? How are you that ignorant to people like even Sean Foyt or Lance Wallnow? These are all different evangelicals in different parts of the world. Charismatic, New Apostolic Reformation. What are we talking about here? Wow.
Some other discussions that are taking place, but because my book is focused on how the culture sees us with respect to these things, I'm not looking at those particular conversations, because here's the kicker. Those are the conversations you would think the mainstream media would be more concerned with, because those are actually looking at, can we make Christianity some kind of official religion or recognize in some official way? You'd think that that's what they're going after. They're not. I don't think I've ever seen an article. I've never pulled up an article that is like, MSNBC coming along and saying, look at these conversations where they're talking about the theology of this and looking back at history and, should we have these Christian leaders? I mean, no one is actually talking about that.
Okay, so she's kind of, in my opinion, she's half right here. Now, this is anecdotal. One of my big critiques is that mainstream media and left-wing media spaces do not talk about Christian nationalism enough. So I agree with her. But my gosh, so many people, including some mainstream people, even my friends over at Mother Jones, absolutely are exposing Doug Wilson. We're exposing the connection between Doug Wilson, a man who wrote a book in 2001 with a white supremacist essentially defending slavery. I'm not kidding. I know some of you don't believe me. I know there's someone out there who's like, that's nonsense. Let me show you something. Let me just show you something here. We're all live. Let's just do this. Doug Wilson. Let me just show you. This is from his own blog. Okay? I'm just going to read you a quote of what he wrote in the book Southern Slavery as It Was. Okay? Here's what he wrote. I'm going to read part of this. Slavery as it existed in the South was not an adversarial relationship with pervasive racial animosity. Because of its predominantly patriarchal character, it was a relationship based upon mutual affection and confidence. There has never been a multiracial society which has existed with such mutual intimacy and harmony in the history of the world. Should I keep going? I'm not going to keep going. I just want you to hear that. Doug Wilson was interviewed by Tucker Carlson, the right-wing media person that most likely Melissa and Natasha think that he says some good things. He was interviewed by Tucker Carlson. Doug Wilson has a lot of churches underneath of him. One of them is a church that Pete Hegseth, the man in charge of our military, goes to. The same Pete Hegseth with Crusader iconography on him. The same Pete Hegseth who was on a podcast called the Red Pill Reformation Podcast, hosted by the church that he attends. So yes, Natasha, people have been talking about this relentlessly, trying to expose that there are Christians, conservative, evangelical leaning Protestant Christians who believe that they have a divine mandate to take over America. In fact, and we're going to get into this in a minute, towards the end of this conversation, she goes down the deep rabbit hole of the problem of queer identity and the hypersexualization of children and queerness. We'll get into that. But what's so funny is that she picks up on these people in history to prove her point, yet on Christian nationalism, she never mentions R.J. Rushdoony. One of the architects behind modern Christian nationalism today, a prolific writer in the 60s and 70s. So it's just so selective. It's all there. There's Angela Denker. There's so many books on this. It's so frustrating to hear her talk like this. The evidence is right in front of them.
That's the great irony. What they're concerned with is stuff that they shouldn't be concerned with, even from a civic perspective, because this is just how our democracy is intended to work. So they're expressing concern that we're advocating based on our religious motivations, basically, that we want pro-life policies. That's the way a democracy works. We all bring our views to bear in the public square. It's not anti-democratic.
Right. And when we reject your views, that's not hostility. Do you understand how that works, Natasha? If we're all in the public square debating and you say, hey, I think gay people shouldn't have the right to marry, and we all agree overwhelmingly, no, they should have the right to marry, it doesn't affect you, and you say, well, I'm going to help push for laws and policies and politicians that would change that, we're going to say, we don't like that you're doing that. You should stop. That's bigoted. And then when you say, oh my God, you're being so hostile towards me for having a Christian worldview, that's not fair. Hold the worldview. The government is not forcing Melissa or Natasha to recant their ideology. They make probably a decent amount of money doing this work, pushing these books. I'm sure whoever did the book for her gave her a nice advance. Melissa has 300,000 subscribers. They're probably making a comfortable living espousing these views. No one's taking away their right to speech. However, we can reject their ideas, and we do. That doesn't mean that we're hostile. It means that we reject your bad ideas for the common good. Reject it.
Anyway, it's not theocratic. As I talk about in the book, just get to some basic definitions. Theocracy means that you're formally recognizing a deity as the official deity of your country. Yeah. Well, they're not pointing to any of those cases.
Doug Wilson wants in the Constitution before he dies, Jesus Christ is Lord. There you go. There's a source. Why are we talking about this?
Look at these articles or you look at these videos. They're not giving cases like that where Christians are doing that.
So
they're
cases.
Calling it theocratic and they're calling it anti-democratic. They're saying it's extreme and pervasive and dangerous. Yes. But it's only dangerous because we want our views to be imposed on someone else.
Oh my gosh. This is I mean this. When I made this title, the worst, I think, case for Christian nationalism or defense, I meant that. This is shockingly bad. Shockingly bad. She hasn't read, it sounds like she hasn't even read one book by one scholar on Christian nationalism just to understand the perspective. This is horrible. Have you not heard Lance Wallnau, the Seven Mountain Mandate? You know that Frank Turek participates in America Fest, which Lance Wallnau also participates in. Like, like this is clear. Sean Foy, yeah, we're a Christian nationalist. Yeah, we want to take over. I have a clip of that. I gotta see if I can find it and play it for you guys. Like, it's all right there. Give me a break.
And as I go through a lot of explanation on in the book, that's just the nature of public policy. In every single public policy, you're imposing one group's views on someone else. You know, if it's a speed limit, even, you know, you're imposing the view that there should be a speed limit at this level on those who don't think that there should be. You know, murder being wrong. Well, you're imposing the view of the vast majority of people that murder is wrong on those who are like, hey, I wish that we could just do whatever we want because I'm pretty mad right now, right? So this is just the nature of public policy. It's not an imposition in any way that any other group is not making themselves. It's all rhetoric.
Right, and
it's
we
all
can
rhetoric.
reject it.
And what they do, I know this is a long answer to your question, but let me just give you
I'm
one more example.
Yeah.
What they do to push this through, so it's a little bit less obvious, is that they'll come up with examples sometimes that are truly cringeworthy. I mean, like, you know, a Christian holding up a sign, you know, that just says something ridiculous, like Trump is my savior. You know, things like that make you go, oh my gosh, like take the sign down. But they'll post a picture like that with the article. You see the examples that they give, but they've posted it with something problematic, and they put it all together as one package of problematic things, whereas it's not actually problematic in the content. It's just that they're giving you, look at this picture, look how awful this is. And
well, I'm sorry. I would think that people who are obsessed with the biblical worldview and who are obsessed with, like, you know, warning against idolatry would be pretty freaking mad that people are holding signs up like that, or that there are books written about Donald Trump being the second coming of Christ. That's a true thing. Donald J. Trump, the son of Christ, the man, the son of Christ, by, what's his name? I can look it up. Hold on. I'll pull it up for you guys. You're seeing my behind the scenes. You're seeing all my secrets. Just kidding. Let's see. Let's do this one. Let's do this one. I was looking up some stuff in preparation for this. So Donald J. Trump book. Messiah. What is the name of the book here? There it is. Yeah, here you go. President Donald J. Trump, the Son of Man, the Christ. These are like real books, guys, written by people who love Trump. Like, where's the condemnation? Why wouldn't you be freaking out? I'd be freaking out. I would be losing my mind. In fact, we're losing our mind that Trump thinks that he's a messiah, and that there's a world that Natasha and Melissa are kind of adjacent to, or sometimes even intermingled into, that prop him up that way. And again, if we're going to use the biblical worldview argument, there's a lot of talk in the Bible about idolatry and worshiping false gods. So you're going to call that out? Like, what are you going to do? I'm not even sure what to say. This is truly shocking.
And it builds it up in people's heads as like, oh my gosh, Christian nationalism is this dangerous, scary, awful thing.
Yes.
Yes,
So it's basically a propaganda tool.
It is in a lot of cases, yes.
It's very interesting. That's a very good point that you brought up.
It's
about
a propaganda tool. Yes. Yeah. Lance Wallnau, 7 Mountain Mandate, storming the Capitol in the name of God, the whole New Apostolic Reformation, and then building up for spiritual warfare. Yeah. It's just propaganda, guys. Yeah. Doug Wilson publishing a book called The Case for Christian Nationalism by Stephen Wolfe, and Stephen Wolfe saying in a podcast interview that under Christian nationalism, women can't serve anywhere, and that we have to throw the atheists in jail, and blasphemy laws are enforced. Yeah, guys, total propaganda. Like, we're just making shit up. Like, we're just making shit up. There's really no threat here. I mean, maybe Pete Hegseth is really close to Doug Wilson, but maybe he has Crusader tattoo iconography on top of him, but propaganda. They just hate conservative Christians. Oh my gosh, like the persecution narrative is so ridiculous. It's so ridiculous. Melissa and Natasha, you're not persecuted. You're not even facing hostility. You are in a comfortable bubble where you make content and write books for your audience, and they love you. And they probably think that you are preaching the true gospel. Congratulations. Like, you're doing it.
The problematic theology that Christians are addressing, right? Like that we're looking at this and we're like, oh, I don't think that's right, brother. I think you got that wrong, or whatever it is. And we are, in a really ironic way, in agreement on that, right? Where it's like, I don't think that taking over America and imposing, the laws of Deuteronomy on, people is, I don't know if that, we need to have in-house conversation about that, right?
Oh, that's a slip. Listen to this again. Listen to how she starts and how she ends. Listen, and this is important. Listen to that again.
That you brought up about the problematic theology that Christians are addressing, right? Like that we're looking at this and we're like, oh, I don't think that's right, brother. I think you got that wrong, or whatever it is. And we are, in a really ironic way, in agreement on that, right? Where it's like, I don't think that taking over America and imposing, the laws of Deuteronomy on, people is, I don't know if that we need to have a in-house conversation about that.
Oh, okay. So she starts off by saying we probably shouldn't, but as she's thinking about it, well, maybe there's some nuance to it. We have to have an in-house conversation about it. So the media, okay. So and this is what I call is the one-way street of this world, right? Melissa and Natasha and Sean McDowell and all those folks, they can critique culture. They can call out the quote-unquote trans ideology. They can critique culture for being hostile to them. But if people in the media fire back and expose the Christian nationalism that exists in their midst, that's unfair, that's propaganda, and now that's an in-house conversation, right? Why do they believe that? Because ultimately, they believe that they have an objective truth about God that no one else has, and therefore they are in a position of power to critique, but not to receive a critique. That's how this works, friends. And I would know, and so do many of you, because I grew up in this world. That's what's going on. It's unbelievable. And not to mention how they soft-washed Christian nationalism. Like, it's evident. They're either blatantly ignoring what's going on, or they're just ignorant of what's going on. Either way, it's bad.
Right? And ironically, if they were to be going after that, we would be in agreement. There would be something where, oh, okay, I can see what they're saying. But then if they bolster that and make it sound like it's this is a Christian doctrine, that would be propaganda. It would be like,
no,
okay,
it's
hold
not.
on. Vast majority of Christians don't actually like this or believe this. This is actually a different take for some Christians, possibly in the minority. Because I've come.
Wow. Let's go to the data on this. I had the data. Let's go back to that PRI. So Christian nationalism scale, right, that we talked about. So what they found with these statements, and one of the statements includes that U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. The government should declare America a Christian nation. If the U.S. moves away from our Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. Okay. Who supports it? Where is it? Religious affiliation. 66% of white evangelical Protestants affirm those 5 statements, either strongly or are sympathetic to it. 30% strongly say those 5 things are true. 33% or 36%, say it's not that great. Or no, sorry, they say I'm open to it, but there's some nuance. So again, Melissa, like the facts actually contradict what you're saying. Most white evangelical Protestants are open to the idea that Christians like you and like them should have dominion over all areas of society. That's just the data. And by the way, that number goes up, I believe, if you are, if you identify as evangelical or born again. 67% are adherents or sympathizers. So just saying, like the data's there. They are, and I try and be clear on my end. I don't want to be out of my depth on topics and kind of opine about things. But Melissa's just way out of her depth here, and so is Natasha. Like clearly they haven't read or talked to anyone who's doing the research.
Cross Christians in certain circles that I'm assuming, and this is the other thing, let me get your thoughts on this. I'm assuming that most Christians watching would view something even like dominion theology, which again is kind of like taking over certain aspects of the world of entertainment, like the 7 Mountain Mandate, kind of like in the hyper-charismatic camp. And then you have theocracy. You have all these different camps that kind of look at government and see how, as Christians, we can not just be a part of it, but kind of take over. I've had conversations with Christians where I will use the word Christian nationalism, and I'll say, yeah, no, I don't agree with that. And they look at me like, what? You don't agree with it? And I'm wondering in my head, how are you defining that though, right? Like how am I defining it versus how they're defining it? Because if I hear it, it's typically not something, it's typically in a derogatory way. So what are your overall thoughts about what I just said, and as far as how we should handle this topic as Christians in this space?
I mean, Melissa even kind of admits here before Natasha answers that she's aware of Christians who believe. She's aware of the 7 Mountain Mandate, which happens to be in the more New Apostolic Reformation. She's aware of dominion theology. That's more of like your Doug Wilson camp. So she's aware that in the world that she occupies, there are Christians who hold these views, and she's still minimizing it because I think ultimately in her mind, they're still on the right team. They're still Christians, so it's not as bad. Guys, just to be clear, we all know if there was some deeply well-funded Muslim conglomerate who were saying things like we have to take over the 7 spheres of influence and rule from the top down, you better believe Melissa and Natasha would be freaking the hell out oh my God, they're coming for us. It's Sharia law. It's a nightmare. We have to fight back. But because it's her tribe that wants to dominate and take over and conquer, well, I shouldn't say her tribe, because it's a tribe that she's adjacent to, well, it's just propaganda. It's just propaganda. It's really, we're minimizing it. It's unbelievable.
Well, I know some people are trying to, they understand what's being labeled Christian nationalism. They understand it's basically just you're a Christian conservative. And so they're kind of going the opposite way to maybe reclaim the term. And so they'll say, you know, if someone calls me a Christian nationalist, I say, yes, I am. And they're kind of like proud of that, like that they're going to be a Christian nationalist. I don't personally think that's a good thing. I don't think that that's going to help any of these conversations, because if you say you're a Christian nationalist, somebody is going to have surely a negative view of that you're talking to. So you're not actually engaging in the conversation about what that means. And you're probably just agreeing to a pejorative term without even realizing what you just said. So I don't think that is helpful personally. Like I said, I think when somebody says something about, oh, well, Christian nationalism is so scary. Like there's a book out I saw that came out recently, How to End Christian Nationalism. When
Have
you
read
say
it?
these kinds of things, just start by asking the question. So how are you defining Christian nationalism?
What do you mean?
Isn't it kind of interesting how the same people who believe that like words have singular definitions and objective truth exists then will play the game of, well, how do you define it? Definitions matter. Like, exactly. It absolutely matters. Like, yes, words are not as flexible, are they, Melissa? Or words are not as rigid as maybe you think. So it's so interesting to watch them kind of play both sides of the fence of, oh, it's a postmodern term, and then switch to, well, how do you define it? How do you define it? Like, yes, like definitions do matter. And like we've said since the beginning of this show, scholars have been defining it with empirical data for a long time now. A long time.
Yeah, what do you mean by that? I don't think we should be agreeing to anything, especially when we know it's a derogatory term that people are using about Christians. We have to actually gain clarity. And instead of just, kind of like cleverly saying, well, I'm a Christian nationalist, if we take the time to understand what they're saying, and they say things like, well, a lot of Christians want to impose their own views, their religious views on other people, that's a great opportunity to explain to that person, but wait, how are we doing anything that's not intended by a democracy from the get-go, right? So we can help
educate. Not doing it either. Like, are they not doing this either?
Well, okay, this might shock Melissa and Natasha here, but not all people are religious zealots that think that their religious ideals have to be imposed on everyone else. Some might be, for sure. Not many. It's very possible to hold to like a more secular framework for the common good that allows for people to do things that you wouldn't necessarily agree with or believe in. Again, we have to debate this stuff. We have to work through it. There's a reason why there's so many laws in the books. I get all that, but it's kind of telling, isn't it, that like their take is, well, you're doing it too. Like, are they? And what will happen then, and the way that they make this work is what they'll say is that everyone is religious. Everyone's advocating for a certain type of religion. Secularism is a religion. No, it's not. No, it's not. You don't worship a god in secularism. Secularism. It's been a long day. My Taco Bell hangover is still here, right? You don't worship a god in that world. You don't have a sacred ancient text that you follow. You don't have beliefs about the afterlife if you're a secularist or a humanist. And it's very possible for Christians or people of other faiths to hold certain theological paradigms while recognizing that because of the sanctity of our neighbors and the fact that they're also image bearers, they have a right to exist freely in a society and do things that, again, maybe we wouldn't see is okay. I'll go this far. I will capitulate this. If Natasha and Melissa want to believe that being gay is inherently sinful, go ahead. Believe what you want. Just stop, or just don't allow that fist to hit someone else's face. So believe whatever you want. What we don't want you doing is saying, and therefore, let's legislate laws over other people who hold to no such view, theologically or morally, that we do, and make them now adhere to what we believe. I mean, the inverse of this would be like, and it sounds crazy, but could you imagine if there was like a queer political lobbying group that was like, we want to make it so people who are straight can't get married because of our convictions on this issue? It'd be ridiculous. It'd be like, what? Like, no one's forcing you to be straight. No one's forcing you to be gay. No one's forcing Melissa or Natasha to leave their partners and marry someone of the same sex. It's ridiculous, right? So that's what we're talking about here. Like, especially because they're always talking about culture war issues. And how do they impact people? We know that people have a right, or that people in ethical monogamous relationships usually have a great experience. It helps them feel more bonded, etc. There's all kinds of data here. So anyway, hopefully that makes sense. But gosh, it's just difficult. Hey, FYI, we are going to cut this a little bit short. They go into a whole different topic around the sexualization of children and like gender and queer theory. I'll be honest with you guys. I am just so tired today. I don't have much more in the tank. And honestly, it's a little bit of a aside. It just, we can get into it, but it's kind of what you would expect, right? You're kind of picking different things and you're weaving together this narrative that like drag queen story hour is intentionally trying to make your kids gay. It's just a ridiculous talking point that's been debunked so many times. I don't have enough energy to kind of go through it. So we'll let this segment wrap up and then we'll go from there. By the way, we're almost at 200 likes. Thank you so much. If you are enjoying this stream, I would love it if you were able to give this video a like. Thank you.
Everybody's legislating their morality.
Exactly. And so it gives us an opportunity to educate others. And especially when they say something like, oh, but there's separation of church and state. Well, that's just a misunderstanding of how church and state are, quote unquote, separate. No, and I tackle that and address it and explain all that in the book also. But
wow, it's amazing how Natasha is an expert on constitutional law. She's an expert on Christian nationalism, expert on worldview, on the Bible. Wow, she wears so many expert hats.
To make an interesting note, I think about the NAR stuff in terms of like the 7 Mountain Mandate and, taking control of institutions. To my understanding, and I could be wrong on this, but to my understanding, they are not trying to have a completely different form of government, but rather they are trying to, their theology is leading them to want to take over influence of all these different areas of society. So they kind of have this whole framework for doing that. Let's take over the influence here and here and here and here. So as Christians who don't adhere to that particular theology, we might not agree with the theology behind it or their motivation for doing it. We might not go along with the whole 7 Mountain Mandate thing, but the end result for them is very similar to what it would be for like us in talking about this conversation, that we want to influence government, advocate for the things that are good in society. We want to limit evil. And so we actually end up working for a lot of the same things, even though we're coming from different motivations and maybe a different theological background, if that makes sense.
Bingo! Yes! Yes, you just said it. Yeah, maybe theologically we don't agree with Lance Wallnau, but the end result, absolutely. Absolutely. We should be the ones in charge. We should be the ones influencing. By the way, for them, influence means being in charge, right? Because the second someone gets pushed back, that's hostility, right? Oh my God, woe is us. Our views were rejected by society. We're hated. Well, what were your views? Oh, I don't know. We didn't want gay people to have the same rights that we do. We thought that DEI was like reverse racism and hurting people. Like, what? Well, that makes sense. I mean, look, to do a quick thought experiment here, I think we can stop there. I mean, I think we've all heard enough. To do a thought experiment, you could take the same framework that Melissa and Natasha are operating in, and you can put it into the integration segregation debate of Bob Jones and the fundamentalist movement. It's the same stuff, guys. I'm sorry, it really is. Like, could you imagine if Bob Jones was like, man, I'm really being persecuted for my faith? Well, why, Bob? Because the government's forcing me to integrate the races in my school. Like, I'm not sure if you're being persecuted for your faith or if you're being told you can't be a bigot anymore and that you're hurting people. Like, you see the difference? And I use this example because in hindsight, it's easy to see how black and white that is, right? At the time, there were all kinds of arguments, mainly by white evangelicals, for why the Bible mandated segregation is biblical and scriptural, and that people who did not agree were not true Christians. There's a book on this called The Bible Told Them So by J. Russell Hawkins, if you want, again, a historian's perspective with the receipts. But could you imagine if someone who was a racist was like, guys, I'm being persecuted for my faith because I believe that the Bible is clear on integration and segregation, and the government, the big government, the nanny state government is forcing schools to integrate, and that's a violation of my religious freedom. Is it? Or are you just trying to weaponize that language to actually hurt your black neighbor? And it's the same kind of idea here. Natasha and Melissa, they are very clear about them not liking trans people, or I'm sorry, they wouldn't say that, being against transing people. They don't really think that, being queer is okay. It's probably inherently sinful. And they'll hide behind things like, well, it's just a biblical worldview. We're just holding our convictions for our faith. The Bible's clear. They hide behind that to essentially advocate for bigotry. And then when society rejects them for those views, they claim and cry foul. I do think it's interesting. And by the way, friends, thanks for being here. Thanks for letting me talk about this and respond. I do think it's interesting that if you read, if let's just take for a second, like this idea of a biblical worldview. If you read through the Bible and you just kind of took notes of like, what is God talking about in the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, etc., you would see so many themes of how we treat the powerless, how the powerful oppress the poor. You would see clear teachings of Jesus that, hey, it's really hard, borderline impossible, for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. James 5 is a scathing critique of rich business owners who are exploiting their workers for unfair wages. And the book of James in chapter 5 says, like, woe to you, rich business owners. You're fattening yourselves up like cattle for the day of slaughter. There's a lot of talk about how we treat other people and how we exploit people. But that language is so out of the galaxy for Melissa and Natasha. Right? What they're not saying is, hey, look, as Christians, we believe that a more just society looks like taxing billionaires. Because let's face it, to become a billionaire means you're inherently unethical, stepping on other people in a corrupt system built by corrupt people that exploits the working class. That's not what we're talking about here. They're not advocating for the expansion and the rights of other people. They're advocating for why certain people groups shouldn't have access to the same rights that they have. Or that, perhaps why abortion everywhere needs to be outlawed, even though we know that in certain cases, not only does abortion save lives, but if you want to reduce the amount of abortions, we know that abortion bans don't even work. What we want to do is advocate for universal health care and contraceptives, etc. So I just want to be really clear about this. Like they're advocating for very specific things, and they're ignoring a lot in the Bible that they say is so clear and so black and white when it comes to wealth inequality, when it comes to the poor, when it comes to the widow, when it comes to how we think about systemic issues, etc. So, yeah, that's what I got. I would love your thoughts. I mean, if you're watching this after the live, put it in the comments. Honestly, guys, I think I'm getting sick. When you start feeling that little tickle in the throat, you kind of feel a little wacky. I think I'm feeling it. Or maybe I'm a little anxious. Who knows, right? All right, friends, listen, I really appreciate all of you being here. If you want to follow our work, you can follow it on this channel at The New Evangelicals on YouTube. You can listen to this podcast wherever you get your podcasts as well. It will probably be out in a week or so. And you can also follow us at The New Evangelicals. You can follow me personally at Tim Whitaker Speaks. I'll be back on the Tim and April show with my amazing co-host April on that YouTube channel. Make sure you subscribe. Have a good day. Talk to y'all later.